And I'm going to, but I'm going to read a little bit of it. What I usually like to do at readings is read little bits. And I try to remember to tell you how long the bit takes to read, so you can be mentally prepared. You know, like this is a 2-minute bit, or oh my God, this is a 9-minute bit. You know, you just so you're if you have to get up or something, you know, it's not going to go on forever. You know, at the end of 9 minutes, I can escape. So so I'll do that until I forget to do it. But I do have it written down so I can figure out how many bits I can fit in. Then I also want to talk to you a little bit about both the Caliphs of Baghdad, Georgia, and, well, I guess mostly about the Caliphs of Baghdad, Georgia, and how I came to write it, because it's kind of a story that, you know, in some ways exemplifies, I think, the way anybody kind of stumbles upon a story to write, and the way things change as you work on it. And then also, I think it also exemplifies how, even though I do not sound as though I am from Georgia, and in fact I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is even farther from, well, I guess it's probably, if you made a triangle, maybe it would be equidistant, you know, here and Milwaukee and Milledgeville, Georgia. So I need to give you some background on that, and so I'll do that. But I also want to read you a news story. This book came out, or the hardcover came out in 2010, and I've been working on other things since. I am working on another novel, and I thought about reading a piece of that to you, but I thought, well, I'll already be reading you bits. I'll try to read you something complete at the end. So we're gonna stop at 20 to 8, because that's how long I need to blather a little bit and then read that other story, and then we'll be done, because it takes 16 minutes to read that story. First thing I'll do, before I start making excuses and telling you about why I really am qualified to write a book with a first-person narrator from Georgia, I'm going to read you a little bit of it, okay? And I could tell you that as I was writing this book as a first-person narrator from rural Georgia, and I don't really need to tell you anything else because I'm going to read you the first page and a half, which tells you all the background stuff. Whenever I needed to refresh my memory, or whenever I needed a shot of Georgia voice as I was writing this, I would call my Aunt Sissy, my mother's sister, who lives in Haddock, Georgia, which is not very far from Milledgeville, because Milledgeville, Georgia, is where my mother is from. So here's the very beginning. I'm going to read you this. Oh, now where are my notes about how long it takes are in the other book. Here we go. Oops. Alrighty. I'm going to read you a thing that takes just under 3 minutes. Okay. It's the first chapter, it's a little bit. It's the first page and a half. The first chapter is called Miss Spivey, For and Against. All right. Miss Grace Spivey arrived in Three-Step, Georgia in August of 1938. She stepped off the train wearing a pair of thick-soled boots suitable for hiking, a navy blue dress, and a little white tam that rode the waves of her red hair at a gravity-defying angle. August was a hellish month to step off the train in Georgia, although it was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she got off the boat one time in a place she called El Basra. I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burnt grass alongside the tracks. When folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to someplace else. Irritated or not, the majority of those present were inclined to see the arrival of the new school teacher in a positive light. Hard times were still upon us in 1938, but like my mama said, we weren't no poorer than we'd ever been, and the citizens of Three-Step were in the mood for a little excitement. Miss Spivey looked like just the right person to give it to them. She was, by almost anyone's standards, a woman of the world. She'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London. And during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in the Near East and Africa with a friend of her grandmother's, one Janet Miller, who was a medical doctor from Nashville, Tennessee. After her travels with Dr. Miller, Miss Spivey continued her education by attending Barnard College in New York City. She told us all that at school the first day. When my little brother Ralphard asked what did she study at Barnard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we all had heard. It was there, she told us, in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life, that she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by the famous John Dewey, who was talking about his famous book, Democracy and Education. Professor Dewey was in his 70s by then, Miss Spivey said, but he still liked to chat with students after a lecture, especially female students, she added, sometimes over coffee, and see in their eyes the fire his words could kindle. It was after this lecture and subsequent coffee that Miss Spivey had marched to the Teachers' College and signed up all aflame. 2 years later, she told a cheery, blue-suited woman from the WPA that she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote and forgotten corner of America. They sent her to Three-Step, Georgia. Maybe I'll stop there. That's about 3 minutes. And another reason to read that little part is that right there, in that little part, we encountered two historical characters, two people who really lived. Miss Spivey is not one of them. Although she does have some traits in common with a school teacher that my mother told me about, that she had when she was a kid. But you might recognize John Dewey and his famous book, Democracy and Education, who did indeed teach at Columbia University at that time. And then there was also a mention of Janet Miller, right? Now, probably you never heard of Janet Miller. That's okay if you never heard of Janet Miller. But in doing the research for this book, if you're going to write a book that's set mostly in 1938-39 in rural, in small-town Georgia, and then well, right away you're going to have to do some research, right? Then, if you've read farther in the book, you know that ultimately the book goes back and back and back in time to the founding of Baghdad in Iraq in 796 AD. So there's a lot of research involved, in that as well. And in a book that was absolutely invaluable to me was a book that I came upon completely by accident in the library at Creighton University, an old book published, it was clearly the original edition, and it was published in 1932, I think, and it was written by Janet Miller. And Janet Miller, the name of the book was The Camel Bells of Baghdad. And for reasons I have yet to explain to you, I was very much interested not only in Georgia in 1938-39, because that's where I had decided I was going to set the book, or the main part of the book. I was also very interested in all things related to Baghdad and Islam and the Arabian Nights and everything from the cradle of civilization there, Mesopotamia. So I was interested in all of that. So here's a book. So I just went to the card catalog. In fact, it wasn't a card catalog, of course. It wasn't that long ago. But I found a bunch of titles on Baghdad. Well, actually, I found the call number that would take me to some nonfiction books on Baghdad, and one of them was this book by Dr. Janet Miller, who was a physician. And she was kind of a one-woman doctor without borders. Back in the 1920s, a woman from Nashville, Tennessee. And Tennessee is very close to Georgia, and so I thought, well, here is my first connection between Baghdad, the one in Iraq, and Georgia, which is ultimately what the book does, is show you how those things are connected. The book hadn't been out for very long when I got an email. Well, I should say that I read the wonderful travelogue, the Camel Bells of Baghdad, that Dr. Janet Miller wrote when she was between battling sleeping sickness in Africa and establishing women's clinics in Japan. In between, she took kind of a vacation, and she went to North Africa and the Middle East. And while she was there, after she came back from there, she took a lot of notes. She wrote this book, which is really kind of a travelogue, has wonderful details that were more valuable than anything I could have found in a history book. The interesting thing after the fact is that after the book came out, and after Dr. Janet Miller turned into a character in the book, I didn't know that would happen. I mean, she was one of my sources. I knew that's how I would get Miss Spivey to the Middle East, as I would say, well, she was a traveling companion and secretary to this physician, Dr. Janet Miller. And I thought that one mention that I just read to you now might be the only time her name ever appeared in the book, but that didn't happen. She does become a character, and although it takes her a long time to show up, she does show up. And I have to say, her showing up in the book when she did was as big a surprise to me as it was to anybody who read the book. And then, after having boldly made her a character, after the book came out, I got an email. And the subject line of the email was from a woman named, her last name was Burton, actually, Virginia Burton. And the subject line in the email was, Dr. Janet Miller was my great-great-great-great-aunt. Actually, I can't remember exactly how many greats were there. So I was I opened that email with a little bit of trepidation. I thought, well, maybe this person would not be happy with what Dr. Janet Miller does and says, in the book, although she behaves in an exemplary way. But still, I certainly was taking liberties. It turned out that she was very tickled by it, and in fact sent me a photograph of Janet Miller with her sisters, whose names were America and Minerva. So she was one of 3 children, America, Minerva, and Janet. And America's nickname was Mecca. So all of a sudden, I thought, okay, there's another connection, right? Mecca, Baghdad. Okay, so the connection started coming thick and fast. Even though that doesn't sound all that thick and fast so far, but that's actually an excellent example of the way in which history sort of plays a part in this book. General Sherman, shows up in the book during the March to the Sea. And everybody's heard of General Sherman and knows that he marched to the sea and all that stuff through Georgia. But so does a character named Bilali Mahomet that you might not have heard of. Bilali Mahomet was a West African who was kidnapped and brought to slave when he was a teenager, and spent the rest of his life in slavery, first in the West Indies, and then in Georgia, on Sapelo Island, Georgia. And he, as I said, he was a teenager when he was kidnapped, but he grew up on this West Indian plantation, and it turned out he was a very, very intelligent guy, and he ended up being the overseer and manager of his master's plantation on Sapelo Island. And then when he was in his 40s, this young guy from Georgia, a man named Thomas Spalding, who was in his 20s, who had just inherited this plantation, or the land for a plantation, on Sapelo Island, right off the coast of Georgia. He went looking for somebody who knew how to grow indigo and sea island cotton and the things that he wanted to grow. And so he went looking in where those things were grown in the West Indies, British West Indies, and purchased Bilali Mahomet from his owner there for his knowledge, not as a laborer, but for his expertise. So then Bilali came with his 6 grown-up daughters. They were kind of grown up by then because he was in his 40s, and his wife, or maybe he came with 5 daughters and 2 wives. It's not exactly clear who, in retrospect, but they remained on Sapelo Island, and right up they were there. Bilali had died in 1859, but his children and grandchildren and many, many offspring were a big part of the population of Sapelo Island at the time of the Civil War. And so the book also takes you there. The book takes you to some of Bilali's descendants, specifically his daughter Margaret and his great-grandson. And his daughter Margaret is a historical character, and his great-grandson is someone that I made up, because this is a very bare-bones story, and you have to kind of fill it in. and they are marching back with Sherman to the sea as they are liberated slaves, and they're marching back, or not marching, but they're following the soldiers back. And so that story is in here as well. I have to tell you quickly how I came across Bilali Muhammad. Now, Bilali, I should tell you, I said he was a West African. He was a literate Muslim. I mean, he was an educated, he was only like 14 or 15 when he was kidnapped, but he had been to school already, and presumably his parents also, or his father, was educated. He had, in Georgia, he wrote things down. He had one notebook that came down to us, but who knows how many notebooks he might have had. But there's one notebook that he gave to a white friend of his, a minister, who then, eventually gave it to the library at the University of Georgia. And so that one notebook we have, and in it, he kept notes about what was getting planted when, and tips for this and tips for that, but also sections of the Quran, and also it's like jurisprudence treatises, like law stuff that he obviously had been studying and that he was trying to hold on to, and remember. And who knows, he may have filled a dozen notebooks with this stuff, or 24, but we have the one. And it was, looked like a handmade notebook. I found Bilali Muhammad because I went to Sapelo Island knowing I needed a setting, I needed an island setting for my plot. And part of what I was trying to do was, I was trying to, I'll come back to that. I needed an island for my plot. And so I went to Sapelo Island, and if you ever get a chance to go to Sapelo Island, there are all those islands, there are sea islands along Georgia, the coast of Georgia. Sapelo is one that consists only of a big nature preserve, and then there's actually a hotel retreat house you can rent out for your group if you want. And then there's the nature preserve is part of a state park. And then there is a little village called, oh my gosh. Well, there's a little town called something Hammock. It'll come to me. And that town is popular. Some of the people in that town are, in fact, descendants of Bilali Muhammad. Other descendants of Bilali ended up in my mother's backyard in Milledgeville, Georgia, because when the war began, when the Civil War began, their owner on Sapelo Island put people on boats, took them to the mainland, and marched them inland, so that when the Federals, when the Union ships liberated those islands, they wouldn't find anybody but old people. They wouldn't find anybody they could conscript, into the Union cause. So some of the people some of Bilali's descendants ended up in the very part of Georgia that I was writing about. Now, I was writing about that part of Georgia because that's where my mother was from. I had no idea it had any connection to a literate Muslim who was enslaved and gave, and started a family line that you can still trace them today. So that was a really astonishing thing, obviously. And unfortunately for me, it came kind of late in the writing of the book, and it meant that I wasn't nearly as close to being finished as I thought I was, because then I had to go back. And it's ultimately the wonderful purpose that Bilali served for me in the book is that he is an ancestor of a very important character in the book. And his descendant, whose name is Theo or Theophilus Boykin, is 17 years old and black, and when the book takes place in 1938-39. And I'm going to read to you now another little section, and this section is, this might take as long as 7 minutes to read. But it's about Theo, so I'd like to read that to you. This is a character, a very important character in the novel. And, oh wait. Okay. And again, Gladys, the narrator here, we've also met Gladys just because she's narrating. She's 11 years old, when the book begins. And actually, she's 11 years old for most of the book, although she's very old when she writes the afterwords at the very end, and that's an important part of the book as well. So, yes, indeed, this does take 7 minutes, is what it says here. So I'm going to read to you just the beginning of a chapter called A Bedouin at the Window, which will introduce you to Theo Boykin. I should say that Theo Boykin, Miss Spivey is planning a Halloween party that is a sort of a dress rehearsal for this big bazaar she wants to have, Baghdad Bazaar Festival at the end of the school year. And she's just arrived, as we know. She's the new school teacher, so you can imagine she's sort of shaking things up a little bit. And the caliphs, Gladys Caliph, the narrator, and her brothers and sisters tell Miss Spivey that she needs to get in touch with Theo Boykin if she wants to have a really cool haunted house at her Halloween party. So here's how the chapter goes, or the beginning. Theo Boykin was the smartest person in Piedmont County, and everybody knew it. Whether folks liked it or not was another matter. Theo, who was about the same age as Force, her brother, 17, could do sums in his head better than Mrs. Bibbin's adding machine at the store. And he could read you anything he laid his hands on, even if he never saw it before in his life, without ever stumbling over a single word. One 4th of July, when the parade marshal of Piedmont County waited till the last minute to line up his post-parade program, he couldn't find but one person in Claytonville, Brennan, and Three Step combined who knew all the words to the Declaration of Independence. Theo was 10 or 11 at the time. You'd better believe a murmur went through the audience when he stepped up to the podium on the courthouse lawn in Claytonville that day. But by the time he got to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he had the whole audience in the palm of his hand. I'm told they applauded louder and longer for Theophilus Boykin than they had for the tap dancers or the Land of Liberty tableau. He could draw, too. Miss Templeton, his teacher at the colored school out in the country, said one time that Theo was a Renaissance man, by which she meant he could do anything he put his mind to. This led to Miss Spivey calling him Signor da Vinci later on, when he was drawing up plans for the Baghdad Bazaar, beautiful sketches with numbers and arrows to show what went where. None of us knew who Signor da Vinci was until we had a lesson at school on him and Michelangelo that included the opportunity to lie on your back and paint whatever you wanted on the underside of your desk for as long as your arm could stand it. When Theo came to Three Step School to see about Miss Spivey's haunted house, Forrest and Ralford and I came with him, as did his brother Eugene, a quiet boy who was a little younger than Theo, but bigger and taller than all of us. Eugene waited outside, leaning against the trunk of the walnut tree. Miss Spivey invited him to come in, but he declined. Theo hesitated at the back of the schoolroom himself, which caused me to remember something from a long time before. When I was in the 1st grade, my brother Forrest brought Theo to school with us one time. I don't recollect why. Our teacher, Miss Chandler, at the time, met us at the door and explained that even though Theo Boykin was smart as a whip, the law prohibited her from allowing him inside Three Step School. She might have said that she could not permit him to get a foot in the door, but what I heard was to put his foot on the floor, which made me wonder. If somebody would pick him up and carry him, could Theo come inside? Or what if we put a carpet down for him to step on? I had the idea that his feet were the problem, like ours, in walnut time. And I know I thought about pointing out to Miss Chandler, in my 1st grade wisdom at the time, that the bottoms of Theo's feet were the lightest part of him, and no threat at all to her floor. I had noticed this paleness on the hands and feet of colored people only recently. In fact, it was Theo Boykin who pointed it out to me. We were all cleaning white clay off ourselves after digging some out of a hole in the Boykins' yard, when Theo rubbed his palms together and said, "Well, look at here, Gladys. That white dirt bleached the color right off my hands and feet." This seemed plausible to me, especially in Piedmont County, where white dirt is abundant. His mama set me straight on the matter. She scolded him for teasing. In the doorway of Three Step School that day, Theo Boykin took off his work shoes and carried them, one in each hand, across the threshold. He set his 2 bare feet flat on the pine floor under which crickets were singing their swan song, it being late in October. You could see him take a quick inventory of the place. The neat rows of desks in 3 graduated sizes, the map that pulled down like a window shade, and the blackboard as big as the whole front wall of the room, except where the door to the half room broke into it. The long, tall windows, 4 on each side of the room, had glass in every pane but one, due to a ball game last winter. Miss Spivey, who was waiting for us, acted like it was the most natural thing in the world for Theo Boykin to step inside 3-Step School. "Come in," she said, "and please take a seat." But she did seem a little shy about telling him what she had in mind for the haunted house. "Well, I thought we'd hang some sheets and wet string in the half room," Miss Spivey said. "Make people walk through it in the dark." Theo paced the length of the glorified closet that constituted the half in our 1.5-room schoolhouse. It had no windows and no electric light and was almost completely dark. When he stood in the doorway, his white shirt and expertly patched gray pants were easier to see than the expression on his face. Miss Spivey said, "What do you think?" "Ma'am," he said, "a white sheet never fooled anybody. What you need is something moving. We can fix it so if you open the door, things drop down and slide around, ghosts swooping like they're coming to get you, like that. Spiders are good too and easy to fix up. And I might have time to make a skeleton if I could get some help with that. I got a skull we could use." We all held our breath for a second when he said that. "A deer skull," he said. "They're about the right size. Skeleton's the best, Miss Spivey. Nothing scarier than a skeleton rattling its bones. Do y'all know why?" We knew just to wait, but Miss Spivey said, "Why?" "Because everybody knows they've got one of those alive inside of them," Theo said solemnly. "They got to carry it into bed at night." So that's 7 minutes of Theo Boykin, whose ancestor is Bilal Muhammad, although Theo Boykin is a fictional character. And it took me a very long time to realize that Theo Boykin was the protagonist of this novel. I thought it was Miss Spivey for quite a while. And Miss Spivey is definitely an important character. And you could make a case, actually, for her as the protagonist. Well, I can't give away too much, but it's Theo. It's Theo. And there's a very useful definition of protagonist that I came across one time. You know, you think of it as the main character, right? You know, the hero. And those things apply, certainly the hero applies to Theo Boykin in the book, with the antagonist, you know, against him, right? And that's true, but the really useful definition of a protagonist that helped me in writing everything, actually, but in writing this book in particular, and also revealed to me that Theo was the guy, was this. And it comes from a writer named Stephen Koch, I don't know how he says his name, either Koch, I'm not sure. But in any case, he says that the protagonist is the character whose fate determines the meaning of your story. If you think about that, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the character who gets the most pages. And Theo is not the character who gets the most pages, although he gets plenty of pages. But he doesn't get the most. He doesn't get as many as you'd think if he's the main, the book is about him. But that's what it turns out. It turns out the book is about him. And it is his fate that determines the meaning of the story. Another important character, of course, is Gladys, the narrator, and Miss Spivey, the teacher who comes, the Teach for America type teacher who comes for actually she's there less than a year, but in any case, she comes for 1 year and really shakes things up, but in the end is not responsible for what happens to the town. The town has to kind of pick things up and make it work when bad things happen as a result of involving Theo Boykin so closely in the activities of 3-Step School and the Baghdad Bazaar, which really gets out of hand by the end of the book. we have a few more minutes before I have to turn to reading you the news story that I want to read you. And so let me ask first, does anybody have a question? Or, maybe people who have read the book? Or even just from what I said so far? Like, I don't know. I don't know what I could suggest that you ask. No questions? No questions? I want to suggest that you look at two things if you're interested further in this book. And one is the website that Gladys Califf, who's 11 through most of the book, as I said, but who's a very old lady on the occasion of the 72nd annual Baghdad Bazaar, and writes a little afterword for the book to go with that. And maybe since you don't have any questions, but feel free to raise your hand if you want to and ask one. And okay.
I want you to read the protagonist's definition.
Oh, say that. Okay.
Yeah.
It's the character whose fate determines the meaning of your story. And maybe determines, he might have said the character whose fate matters most in determining the meaning of your story. He might not have been quite that. And that's how I know it's Theo Boykin. And you need to find out who that character is. Because everything is in the novel. As crazy as this is, it goes all the way back to Baghdad, the founding of Baghdad. And it all has to do with who Theo is. And how, in spite of because of some aspects of who he is, namely the color of his skin, he runs into trouble. And in fact, a reader in St. Louis, there's a wonderful independent bookstore in St. Louis, Missouri, called Left Bank Books. And they have, and I think there's a bookstore in Minneapolis too, that has in response to the multiple fatal shootings of black males, mostly young black males, in the last year, but in the last couple of years, they have a section of books called, they have a book club, they have various things that are encouraging reading. In the section, they have a section of books called Black Lives Matter. And one of them, a bookseller, said we need to include this book in that. Even though it's set in 1938-39, Theo Boykin is an example of a person who is really extraordinary, and everyone knows how extraordinary he is. Everyone knows and admits that he's the smartest person in Piedmont County, and it's not an accident, I have to tell you, because we've all read To Kill a Mockingbird, and I bet most of us have really enjoyed To Kill a Mockingbird. I know I have, but there are, and I shouldn't say but. In some respects, this book is a response to Kill a Mockingbird, and the similarities. Okay, it's in the South, and there's a girl who's the narrator and so forth. But there's a big crucial difference, I guess, too. There's a little flip-flop, because the hero of To Kill a Mockingbird is Atticus, right? The white hero lawyer who bucks the prejudices of the time to represent the black character who is Tom, who is essentially poor Tom. Tom who's been falsely accused of raping a white woman. And what Tom does is, in the book and in the film, is be scared. This is what Tom does. This is his whole role. And in the end of the To Kill a Mockingbird, or toward the end, Atticus, the trial, he lost the case, but there's going to be an appeal, right? This is just the first step. There's going to be an appeal. He's going to argue it all the way to the Supreme Court if he has to. He's going to save Tom. Atticus is going to save Tom. But Tom, in the meantime, has to go to jail or to prison. And I don't know if you remember this from To Kill a Mockingbird, but what he does is he just kind of runs. He just runs for the wall one time. It's not like he orchestrates an escape. He just can't stand it. He's scared. He runs for the wall, and of course he gets shot multiple times, and that's the end of Tom. And, on the one hand, Tom was a plot thread not Flannery O'Connor. I should tell you what Flannery O'Connor said about To Kill a Mockingbird. I will in a second. But what Harper Lee had to do was tie up that loose end. I mean, I think that's the main reason that Tom has to run for the wall and be shot. But, because otherwise the story's not over. And then not that it's not credible, that could certainly have happened. But I would encourage you to go to the website that Gladys mentions at the end here. It's called, it's a real website. It's www.Baghdad Bazaar. And you can look at it here, or I've got copies of the book. Baghdad Bazaar, those two words, smushed together, GA, like the abbreviation for Georgia.com. And what it is it's a website that the people of Baghdad, Georgia maintain. Gladys has a column there. I mean, Gladys is a fictional character, but Gladys has a column, an Ask Gladys column. And it just so happens that she has a column right now about To Kill a Mockingbird. So anyway, you could, somebody's objections to Kill a Mockingbird. But in this book, in the Caliphs, not only is the best read, smartest, genius, hero person in the town a 17-year-old African American who's been taken under the wing of his black teacher and his mother, and he's got Bilali in his history. But the lawyer in the town of Three Step, which becomes Baghdad, Georgia, is the grand goblin of the local Ku Klux Klan. So there is, I make a reversal, and it's a very deliberate reversal so that you got a response to Kill a Mockingbird, another way to look at people and what happened, how they made their way in this very difficult environment, and what sorts of terrible things could happen to them, but also what sorts of wonderful things could happen. How people were human beings, I should also say that I mentioned that my mother is from Milledgeville, Georgia, and my father is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is why I sound the way I do and not like my mother. But her whole family, my mother's whole family, is pretty much in Georgia. And as I was growing up, my father met my mother during World War II. He was stationed in, for training in Georgia, and not Fort Benning, somewhere else. Warner Robins, a place that's now Warner, because it was the Army Air Corps. So Warner Robins, Georgia, and Robins Air Force Base is what it is now. And so he met my mother. There's the USO and the girls. My mother was in high school when the war began, and was 19 when the war was over. The war wasn't actually over then. She was 19 when she and my father got married. And then he shipped off to the Philippines, and she went up north to live with my Hungarian immigrant relatives in Milwaukee, which is another whole story. That's my mother's story, and some of which you can read in The Turk and My Mother, my other novel. But because, I guess, when he was trying to convince her to marry him, and she was worried because she had this big, wonderful family that she was very close to, very much like the Caliphs. A lot of the characters are based on my mother's relatives, and not all of them, but many of them are. And she was, hesitant about moving up to Milwaukee. She hadn't even met the Catholic Hungarian relatives, so my father apparently promised her that they would live in Indiana. They would live in the middle of the state of Indiana, equidistant, one day's drive to Milwaukee, one day's drive to Georgia. Well, that didn't happen. I didn't grow up in Indiana. And the compensation was, and if my mother had known my grandmother, she would have known that was not going to happen. But, my dad's mother. But she's very close to her family. So every vacation, every single year of my childhood, through about age 19, we went to Georgia to visit the relatives. And if you go to my author website, not the Baghdad Bazaar one that I just told you about, but MaryHelenStefaniak.com, there's a link to an essay that talks about this, about the effect on me of being from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and sort of small town Georgia at the same time. And what that, and I'll just give you a little hint about it, is this. It's that growing up in Milwaukee in the late 50s and 60s, I never met, Milwaukee was so effectively segregated, not by law, but so effectively segregated that being from a white working class neighborhood in Milwaukee, I never met a black person until I went to high school. And there was a pair of twins at our high school. And once they graduated, then they were gone. There weren't any more black people at my high school either. But, so that's that. I never had occasion to talk to a black person, not a clerk in a store, nobody. And I didn't go downtown much. If I'd have ventured away from the area, I would have encountered black people. In Georgia, where we went every year to stay with my Aunt Sissy, who lived in a very modest little house. In fact, when we went to visit her in the early years, she didn't have an indoor bathroom, which was a great trial to us. But we stayed there anyway, because you couldn't insult Aunt Sissy, right? So anyway, so she lived in a very modest house in this little town of Haddock, Georgia, and her next door neighbors and the people behind her were black. And they did not go to school together. Aunt Sissy's children went to a different school than those children went. But when they came home from school, who did they play with? They played with the kids next door. So there was a very strange, so when I went to my reaction to things in the South, like signs on drinking fountains, which I'm old enough to have seen, that say whites only, colored only. And I could tell that didn't seem like that didn't seem right. The reason I thought you didn't have those in Milwaukee was not that I thought people up north were enlightened. It's because I thought there weren't any colored people. There weren't any black people in Milwaukee. I'd never seen one. So in your small child wisdom, that's how you figure it out. Kind of like Gladys thinking, oh, she must think he's gonna, mark up her floor with his black feet. She doesn't know that won't happen in the sexual area too. So anyway, I do have this sort of, I grew up in a bicultural household, with a mother from Georgia and a father, not just from Milwaukee, but from very close to his European roots. So that is really kind of how this book came to be. I think if I had only grown up in one place or the other, obviously I wouldn't have been able to write it. So it was kind of a serendipitous thing. And there was a lady, I did some readings in the South, and I did a reading at Flannery O'Connor's farm. It's just like this literary place now, a site on the literary trail in Georgia, in the South. And so there was a reading, and a woman came up to me, and she had the book, and she said, and she knew I was the author of the book. So before I read, she came up to me and she said, well, first thing she said was, I really loved your book. So that was nice. Then she said, but when I saw that you were from Iowa, I almost didn't buy it. And you can understand why, right? Who are you to write the book about Georgia? So it was I don't know why I'm telling you all that, other than so that when you meet me, you need to sort of know where did this come from? Not only the Baghdad part. The Baghdad part, frankly, came from the bombing of Baghdad, 2003. From the time from that time on, I was determined to sort of give Baghdad back to us somehow. I don't know, to myself. Change its connotations for Americans. So that's where that part came from. Okay, well, I don't have time to read my story, but I could have time to read part of my story. So I think I will. Any questions? No. Yes?
What was Flannery O'Connor?
Oh, yeah, what did Flannery O'Connor say? Well, Flannery O'Connor's book, Wise Blood, came out in 1951, I think, and I think that To Kill a Mockingbird might have come out in about 1960. And, the 50th anniversary, yes, 1960, because 2010 was the 50th anniversary of it. And then there was a reissuing of Wise Blood. Well, obviously, Wise Blood, big deal, wonderful book, but it did not outsell To Kill a Mockingbird, not by many, many millions. So you got to keep that in mind. But what Flannery O'Connor said was about To Kill a Mockingbird was, I wonder if all those people know they're reading a children's book. And I think she kind of meant it as an insult, maybe. I don't know. If you think about that, I mean, obviously, in those days, there wasn't this sort of sense that books for children, or we call them young adult, books, are the same kind of books that adults read. The main difference I heard an editor say, the main difference between an adult fiction and young adult fiction is that somebody is reading the young adult fiction. And that there's a lot of truth to that too. But Flannery O'Connor wasn't coming from there. She was coming from, here's the literature for adults, and then there's the book that's really a children's book. And in a sense, I mean, I wouldn't argue with her, but there are many children's books that everyone should read. Right? So here's what I got. I'm going to read just the beginning of this. This is crazy. I don't know why I'm going to read just the beginning of this. This is a story called Tattoo 2082. 2082 is the year. This is the only story I've ever written set in the future. And the first thing I want to know, if you're willing to say so, actually you don't have to raise your hand, just think, well, you could if you want. You can if you want. Who in this room has one or more tattoos? Not that many? Well, maybe people have. Oh, quite a few, okay. Then, is there anybody in this room named Jared? Any Jareds? You know a Jared? Anybody know a Jared? Yeah, raise your hand if you know a Jared. That's better, okay. So Jared didn't come to the reading, but in any case, we know Jared's. How about Caitlin? Any Caitlins here, or a Caitlin? Does anybody know a Caitlin? Okay. Because if there had been a Caitlin or a Jared here, or a Drew or a Kyla, no Drews or Kylas, reading of this story was going to be dedicated to them. But since there aren't any of those people here, it will be dedicated to everyone in the room who has a tattoo. All right? And this is a weird story. Okay. So it's set in 2082. Like the internal combustion engine, repurposing Florida seemed like a good idea at the time. Key West had already gone under in 2043. Its submersion followed for many years by apocryphal sightings of web-toed cats, some as far north as Long Island. Everybody knew that old folks liked the weather down there, and many of the existing residential towers with their great ocean views had been built to survive hurricanes and storm surges. They were well suited to rising waters, their AC and electrical strategically installed. Why not use that melting real estate as a home for those who wouldn't need it for long? Everything south of the line, from West Palm Beach on the Atlantic to Fort Myers on the Gulf side, looked like fair game. There was money to be made. Investors were making it. And so it was that longtime friends and fellow residents Kyla, Caitlin, Jared, and Drew were playing a game of bridge one morning, girls against boys, in the newly remodeled Canteen Solarium at Aventura Assisted Living Condominiums and Resort, formerly Miami Lifestyle Condos, when an automated laser nurse floated through the room at just below hip level. Using technology developed in the early 21st century for eradicating mosquitoes, one male at a time, the auto nurse laser targeted each of the oldsters in turn, dispensed the right dosage of the right drugs, and then floated noiselessly into the breezeway beyond. Jared remarked, "I hate that robot, bitch." Drew, a former Rhodes Scholar and author of 2 well-received volumes whose subject and titles he could occasionally recall, pointed out that the auto nurse was not, in the strictest sense of the word, a robot. Actually, said Kyla, a former National Science Fellow, it is. Well, it's certainly not a bitch, Caitlin put in, laying her cards on the table. The 4 of them found it amusing to think that everyone used to play games like bridge with physical cards of plastic-coated paper. Paper, mind you. When Drew's great-grandson gave him a vintage boxed set of 2 decks and a molded polystyrene holder, the 4 amigos, as they sometimes called themselves, Caitlin being a former high school Spanish teacher, had taken to playing cards in person. They started in the old canteen on the 10th floor, back when the windows had offered a view of red tile roofs and the flashy tops of palm trees. The windows in the new canteen solarium looked out from the 35th floor over nothing but sea and sky. You had to go up to the roof to spot the other residential towers poking up out of the water in an archipelago that stretched north and south as far as the eye could see. Both decks of cars were worn around the edges and had acquired a greasy feel, but still they played. Between tricks, they reached for their I-breathe O2 inhalers. By 2082, atmospheric oxygen levels had dropped around the globe, the obesity problem having been long since solved by the invention of cellulose noodles. Americans now counted units of oxygen expended rather than calories consumed, and oxygen conservation, a marriage of time motion studies and scuba diving technique, was the fastest growing field in the 49 states. Jared had made his fortune in it, having gotten in on the ground floor 70-odd years ago, around 2012, with an undergraduate research project to determine which was more oxygen efficient, the twist-off cap or a handheld bottle opener. The O2 measuring protocol that he designed was still in use. Millennials, they used to be called. They were 10 or 11 at most in 2001. Images of tiny people holding hands as they jumped from tall buildings were embedded in their collective unconscious. 3 out of 4 of them had helped a grandchild build a tower of blocks and fly a toy airplane into the side of it to knock it down. An odd feeling of relief and expiation, the end of suspense, the emptying of guilt, always came over them as the blocks tumbled down to the sound of the grandchild's laughter. The wars had missed most, but not all of them. Caitlin and Kyla, friends since they were first-year college roommates 3/4 of a century ago, no longer remembered which one of them had actually dated the handsome ROTC boy across the hall, or where in the world he was when his Jeep ran over an IED. In April 2010, when the Gulf oil spill began with a blast that became a rupture between all time up to that moment, i.e., time poised as time used to be toward the future, and all time since. Most of them were still in college. Kyla remembered a family visit to her great-grandmother on day 20, which happened to be Mother's Day. On a TV in the visitors' lounge, oil was billowing like great clouds from a hole in the bottom of the sea. Her great-grandmother said, "Where's the genie? I think they forgot the magic word." Now they were in their 90s, and in surprisingly good shape for their advanced years. Beneficiaries of the anti-aging push that began in the late 20th century, shortly before they were born, Kyla, Caitlin, Jared, Drew, and their contemporaries had extended their middle years well into their 70s and put up with only minor inconveniences after that: the need for a nap, an easily bleached age spot or two, a baby toe bent on bunyan hood, until they hit 90 or so, at which point old age caught up with them. For some, this was a calamity that no amount of prescription swapping and drug adjusting could assuage, mend, undo. For others, it was the result of a self-imposed moratorium on the drugs and procedures that constituted modern medicine's fountain of youth. Among our card players, Jared and Caitlin fell into the former group, the ones who switched doctors and drug regimens on a regular basis, while Kyla and Drew were among those who'd had enough and were ready, they thought, to go gently when the time came. It was Caitlin who noticed something new among Jared's tattoos as he totted up the score on his phone that morning. "What's that?" she said, pointing to a streak on his forearm. "It's a tattoo, you Nimrod," he replied. Jared could be kind of a dick. They all had tattoos, souvenirs of their 20s and 30s and other distant decades. Dragons were now frog-like smears, flowers had faded into monochromatic fussiness, skulls looked like ponds, and unreadable words declared allegiance to rock bands and other entities mercifully forgotten. "Yeah, but what about the numbers?" she said. "Are those new?" "What numbers? What the hell are you talking about?" Jared said. He peered down at his arm. "I don't see any numbers." "Right there." Caitlin poked with her bony finger at a spot on the bluish expanse of ink that extended from Jared's wrist to the inside of his elbow. The reclining nude was one of many once colorful tattoos that Jared was glad to see broken up by age spots and wrinkles. Now it looked more like a fish. Jared squinted. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Where the hell did that come from? I'll give you one more sentence. That was a string of numbers. In Jared's case, the numbers were 546051382. They curled unmistakably along the underbelly of the fish shape, obscuring even more effectively its original human form. By dinner time, dozens of residents had found numbers in their tattoos, some with the help of the young woman who gave massages in the spa. Dinner, which you could prepare in your own kitchenette or choose from 3 menu items offered in the slowly revolving dining room on the 40th floor, turned out to be an almost indecent affair, with people unbuttoning and unzipping and even dropping their pants, a few of them, to show their neighbors what they had discovered. I'm going to stop there because it's 8 o'clock. So, thank you all for, oh yes, well, a question? His number? His number is 546051382. That's Jared's number. Now, Drew is going to find a number. Lots of people find numbers that they interpret as dates. As the story goes on, everybody finds meaning in their numbers. You know, you can find something in there. You can find your ACT scores, or your lipid panel, or your blood pressure, or your social security number, if you're really lucky, right? So everybody's finding meaning in the numbers, but nobody knows why the numbers are emerging in these deteriorating tattoos. And I was going to read you the whole story, but yes? Hog Hammock. Thank you for asking. Hog, H-O-G, Hammock, H-A-M-M-O-C-K. You know, and a hammock is like a little hill. Yep, not hummock, hammock. Well, I think we're finished then. Are we finished? Thank you very much.